All right, so welcome everyone. This is for many of you might be a new topic. It is rather new in the domain of AI, how to actually interpret, audit AI technologies. We are going to go through two parts in this talk, and you can see here the part one is more about introducing some definitions, a bit of the taxonomy, what it is, some examples. We are trying to motivate why we need interpretability. And in the second part, we are going to go through some of these methods. Some might be a bit too technically oriented, so I'm going to distill the information for you, so then you get the essentials about how these methods work. At the end, I prepared a short quiz that I hope can also help you for the learning objectives of the session. And I have a little surprise in between, just before part 1 and 2, a little video. As a short break, we're gonna maybe do 5 minutes break between the two parts. So as an introduction, we know that deep learning in medical imaging has been, since I would say 2014, when we saw the first uses of AI or deep learning in medical imaging, has been increasing over the years. What you see here there's some plots, some figures from this survey from 2017 from Medical Image Analysis Journal on deep learning in medical image analysis. So it's a nice review. I recommend. And what you see here is uses of deep learning per organ, per anatomy, per modality, and then the different fields. And so here you can see the number of papers published, how it's growing in every field mostly. And uses, I think you have seen already very much during the last sessions, different uses. Here just to motivate the aspect of interpretability, where, for example, you are using a system to parse medical images. Let's say you're building a dictionary, or you're building a catalog of images, and you want a system to automatically classify them into the different anatomies, or you want to create an atlas in an automated manner. Very classical segmentation is one of the pillars of medical image analysis, where you want to automate delineation task. And here you see it in so many different fields. You also do classification. Long is one of them, where you want to classify an input image into a given class, a given condition. Or at the bottom, you have a neuro, where you want to classify into 3 different classes in order to have a mechanism to detect progression of a disease. Other tasks include more the quantitative aspects, for example, where you want to quantify brain cortex, curvatures, thickness, and so on. This you can do with deep learning, and what you see here is an example of image registration. So probably you are familiar with registration, where you want, or fusion, where you want to align images from different subjects, from different modalities. Today you can do it with deep learning in a completely unsupervised manner. So therefore you don't need any supervision, you don't need any preparation of data. There are mechanisms now to do it completely unsupervised in few seconds. People are also using, what maybe you have seen this, the famous UNet architecture for actual image reconstruction. So actually here you take a sinogram, and instead of doing a filter back projection, you actually learn that process with a deep learning architecture to do the reconstruction. And results are promising. You see an increase in the signal to noise ratio. You have sharper images, and there is an added value on using these technologies on the sort of post-processing that's incorporated in the quality of these images. Other uses, this is very interesting, where now people start combining. You see here there is a network where you actually, the system, you have the reports. The reports are processed by a recurrent neural network. So this is a stream of information, so words, and the system starts analyzing the position of the words and the relative positions between words. This is combined with a deep learning architecture that analyzes the image itself and then makes a labeling or classification of both pieces of information. So this is more on the direction of multiomics, right, where you have imaging plus non-imaging information being incorporated in deep learning. So all of this is bringing spin-off companies, is bringing a lot of industry interest, and even the FDA is talking about the importance of AI and the importance of, for themselves to actively develop new regulatory frameworks to facilitate this area. Now, what's the secret? Probably you have seen it in previous sessions, the fact of this deep aspect of neural networks. What you see here is a competition results over different years for a computer vision task where a computer needs to analyze and classify natural images. So here you have thousands of images of cats and dogs and houses and trees and just objects or scenes, and the computer needs to find the right class. The human performance is about here with an error of about 5.1% error. So when a human does it, it's about 5% error. In the past, so 10 years ago, the error of the computer was about 28-30%. So it was about a factor of 4. We started seeing the decrease of this error as we increased the depth of these neural networks. So shallow indicates a very, very simple model with few layers. And as we increase the layers from 8 to 19 to 22 and so on, we start seeing a decrease in the error. Human performance was surpassed in 2015 when a residual network was used having 152 layers, getting to an error of 3.6. Now, probably this was possible because of hardware, so GPU, and also some of the mathematical tricks that have been incorporated in the last years. So with this increase of complexity by having so many layers and millions of parameters that need to be optimized during the training process, we are making these systems more difficult to understand. What you see here is a depiction of different types of machine learning. You see random forest, decision trees, and deep learning is over here, having an explainability level that's way below than other systems. So there's a trade-off between explainability and accuracy. Now, why then do we need to actually interpret these systems if maybe they are actually working? And maybe also a human cannot fully explain a given phenomenon. So interpretability here, it's used to describe the link between the information, what we call features, used by the machine learning and the prediction itself. I'm going to show some examples why it is important to understand. And I think the key word here is that we need to be careful about those links between features and the prediction itself. I'm going to show some radical examples where those links are completely wrong, are completely biased, and they stem from bias in the data, bias in the annotation process, and so on. Are there any questions until here? I think I can see the chat very well. Let me quickly check. I'm not missing out. There are many definitions about interpretability of explainability. So some people have talked about an explanation should be something that makes it easier to understand without sacrificing the accuracy of the model. So in order to understand, we humans, we tend to simplify. And by simplification, we also trade off accuracy, right? So there's again this trade-off. In order to gain accuracy, we increase complexity. In order to increase understandability, we decrease that complexity. So explainability now would be a manner that without sacrificing accuracy, we can actually understand in a simplified manner. Now, in the literature, you might find explainability and interpretability. Now, in practice, I think we can use both. There are some differences. For example, people refer to explainability when you want to explain the process behind. An example here is when an apple is falling, the explainability of this is because gravity is making that apple fall. Whereas interpretability, you want to understand or predict the cause-effect phenomena. In the case of the apple example, you know that gravity is there, but you know that the cause effect is if I cut the apple from the tree, the apple will fall down, right? So many times you don't have the mechanism to fully understand the gravity equivalent of a given condition. We don't know everything in biology, but we know mechanism, we know cause effect. And there is where many times interpretability can be quite useful to check that that cause effect is a reliable source of information. So why do we need interpretability? We have accountability, right? We want to make sure that a system that's used in the clinics for patient treatment is accountable, and we can actually be accountable when we use that information from that system. Trust, I think when we start adopting a system, when we start using a phone with some new features, we need to build that trust because we don't fully understand the risk that usage of that new feature might imply. Therefore, in medicine is the same. When we incorporate a new technology, we need to sort of check that that technology is trustful, and then we can just adopt it to the point where we can even have a positive bias, where a doctor could say, I've been using this system for so many years, I don't even look anymore on the results of the system. So we go from trust into a potential positive bias that we also need to be careful about. We are not yet there for AI systems, I believe, but I think in the future it might be a case where we see many positive biases going on. Quality control, we want to have an assurance about the results of the systems. And quality control of the data is one thing. We want to make sure that the data that was used to train that system doesn't have any bias. And quality assurance is we want to evaluate the system itself. Ethical aspects, we want to check that there are no ethical components in the bias that the system might be incorporating. Or finally, data exploration. We want to understand maybe new mechanisms that are explored or discovered by the AI system that might lead to a new biomarker, a new way of describing a phenomenon. I was looking into the literature of first explainability systems, and I was surprised to, and maybe not so surprised at the same time, looking at a system used in the military. Where here you have a system, a simulator, where you could actually have rules to explain things like why a given unit was moved to a given position, why a given event happened, for example, a shooting of a unit, why shooting happened, or why that unit actually lost another component. So this was one of the first simulators or systems that were trying to explain decisions of an AI system. Now, in this approach was completely rule-based. There was no data-driven learning. Everything was completely algorithmic, based on rules. But there was a module on explainability used to understand the decisions of the system. So, for example, here's some recorded events: weapon fire, unit generation where a given, for example, battalion was moved from one position to the other. A friendly soldier was killed in action, and the system was then having all these questions: what's the platoon mission, the status, how's the task organized, and so on. Now, accountability. Now we go for the specifics of Europe. We have GDPR since May last year. We have in May 2018 now. We had a new regulation, and there's one single article that makes AI systems integration more complex, more difficult, in the sense that a completely unmonitored controlling or checking of the system is very difficult for us. So AI system that's fully automated needs to provide explanation as to why that system is predicting a given decision. So a concrete example would be a patient who was diagnosed with cancer, fully automated. The report was generated by the system, and this is what it's then used. That machine learning system needs to provide an explanation as to why that patient was diagnosed with cancer. Now, we could come with a probability saying there is a 90% the system predicted that this patient might develop cancer. But that's not sufficient explanation from a legal point of view to say, because the system calculated a number, that's a sufficient reason to let that decision pass. So more human or human readable explanations are then needed to explain these decisions. In the area of finances, for example, many AI systems are not used because of this reason. So, for example, someone who is going to be evaluated for a loan using machine learning, people prefer to use machine learning using features that are human readable. For example, if the credit of that person, the age of that person, the record of that person, those are features that are human readable and therefore can be used to explain why a given person is given or not given a loan. Now, quality assurance, we want to evaluate the system. We want to ensure it's robust, and we also want to know when it starts breaking. Now, here there is a huge gap. There are efforts to work on these platforms and development of AI systems for AI system assessment. And here's where interpretability can also be considered as a useful tool. Now, going back to the problem of depth, you remember this picture, the human was outperformed in 2015. So then you could say, well, the deeper, the better. It should be as deep as possible. The matter of the fact that is yes and no. By going deeper with a neural network, you are actually making your optimization more complex, more complicated. And this is one example. You have here a system that has 20 layers versus a system that has 56 layers. The system with 56 layers might, according to this plot over here, should be better and therefore having a lower test error. But in this case, it's not the case. Why is this? The system with 56 layers has more complexity, has many more parameters to be optimized, and therefore the optimization process is more complex. So we are moving the problem of understanding the data or the complexity in the data or the task itself into the complexity of the optimization process. And what's the problem with this? The problem with this is that a system with 56 layers might introduce biases. It's going to be optimized to maybe find correlates or spurious correlations in the data. So the system is going to find something to bring that error down, but that reason might be wrong. Quality control. If you know that what people say in deep learning, garbage in, garbage out. So it's essential to then also look at interpretability in order to check the quality of the input data. Many times we receive a system, we have little knowledge about how the system was trained, on which data, and interpretability can show us, can make links to potential biases that were introduced due to the poor quality of the data. Here's one example that's talking about what we call in deep learning a domain shift. So domain shift in this example is when you have a system that's been trained on different centers with different machines and protocols. So in this specific challenge, this is for multiple sclerosis. Our colleague, probably you have discussed with Richard McKinley. He actually participated and he ranked first in this competition. Now, one of the features that highlighted the quality of Richard's work here is the increased robustness of his system. So these bars that you see here, each color corresponds to a different center, and each center use a different machine, a different protocol. Now, you want to be as high as possible, so this is in segmenting lesions in MS. So you want to be as close to one as possible. Now, center number 3 was on purpose left out of the test of the training in order to quantify that robustness to an unknown center. And you can see that while humans, so this is all these bars here, do not struggle with that new center, that new machine, deep learning systems, in many cases, they clearly fail on using on testing on that new center. And that's an example where interpretability can be used to perform quality assurance by checking a potential bias or a missing information from a different center or protocol. This is one example. And trust. This is an essential, as we discussed, is essential, especially when we are adopting a new technology. Now, Professor Rees probably talked about it before on the potential of AI to restructure, right? To sort of create a new profile for the radiologist, for the imaging expert. And it's very important that that person feels comfortable with AI and they trust the system. Their interpretability can be used as a proxy to increase that trustability. Now, let me show you some papers that talk about the issues. This is where the trust could be shaken, and there's where we need interpretability to work on these issues. So, for example, there are technologies called deep fooling. So this is a deep learning architecture that's used to fool other systems, to produce perturbations that are really imperceptible to the human eye, but can produce an error of a deep learning machine. That's what you see here on the top left, the same on the top right. These are studies showing this sort of glass cannon aspect of the tool. So you have a technology that's very powerful, but can be easily fooled if you don't make a special care on the way the training happens. I'm going to show you some images on this paper on the top bottom left, showing the importance of texture for convolutional neural networks, a specific type that is the bread and butter of deep learning in imaging. And I'm going to show you what they did, very interesting insights. On the bottom right is also a very interesting study showing in real-world data how the system actually found a bias in the data and used it in order to improve performance. And we're going to talk about it more, what happened there. So these systems, now what they try to do is to try to show you given an image, what are the parts of the image that are actually showing the importance? What is driving the model? I would like to see that part in the image. So the top image, you can see here is an image, very funny, of a Labrador with a hat, and there is actually a person behind and a guitar. So rather complex image, right? And the system was trained to classify in different labels, presence of the guitar, of an acoustic guitar or Labrador. And you would like to actually audit that decision. So Saliency Maps, we're going to talk about it more in detail. They help you to understand which pixels are actually driving the decision. And in turn, you can then verify, well, if that actually makes sense. So here you see the system was using this part of the guitar to say it's an electric guitar. This is an acoustic guitar, so you see here this part, so I think that makes sense. And here it's a Labrador, and you see most of the face of the Labrador present in the image. So you could say, okay, that seems to work. It's a machine learning system that seems to be well trained. Now, a counter example. You see in this image at the bottom left, you see a husky that has been classified as a wolf because there was a bias in the data. Now, the bias was incorporated on purpose to check the robustness of the system. So what happened is here that all wolves images included snow. So the system understood that by detecting snow in the image, the task could be completed. So that's a bias in the data. Now, very similar to that is what happened here on the bottom right. So these are a subset of patients that were treated on an emergency room with a handheld device. This handheld device was every time introducing this little L marker you can see here. And the system was trained to classify in different diseases, pneumonia, and so on. The system then was trained, and this bias was actually picked by the system to understand if I see that marker, I can then classify the image. So you can imagine that the only information that the system was using was that, and the system was completely forgetting the rest of the image. So that raises a lot of issues. Now, the problem is that without that interpretability, you could actually have a lot of difficulties to understand that or to actually spot it. And that's the importance where you could say, we need quality assurance and we need to make sure the system is learning what it should be learning. Now, let's go back to texture. And why is this important in the context of interpretability? So we analyze texture as well in medical images. For example, vascularity of a tumor, we associate that with texture information, right? When we move to one vendor to the other, in a CT scan, the reconstruction kernel changes because you want sharper images that will modify your texture. If you move from one device to the other in an MRI, that will modify your texture information. Therefore, that can bias your system. So what they did here is they took images, they started removing the information. So you see this cat, you remove the color, you remove the rest, and you just leave the silhouette. You only leave edges, and counterexample, pure texture. Now, you train systems, and you also ask humans to do this classification. What do you see here? So here, no problem. All top-notch systems. So you see AlexNet, Google, VGG, all these are like very popular architectures in deep learning, no problem. Humans, 99%, maybe someone says, well, I see a carpet, or I don't know, but there is no problem here classifying that image. What happens when we remove color? Systems are more or less the same. There is a bit of reduction, but minor. What happens if we only work with silhouette and edges? There is a drastic drop in performance. You can see that the best performing system is a ResNet 50. That's a huge network. Doesn't even hit 55%. And with edges, it's the same. Now, what happens when you only show texture? Computers were seeing an elephant there, right? Whereas humans, well, maybe could be something else, right? Because humans have more ways of understanding that image. But computers were so biased by the texture, saying, well, it's an elephant, and it was an elephant, so they always they had a 100% accuracy. But that's a counter example. So we see that CNNs are very conditioned on the type of texture and information. And these type of examples, they are called ablation studies. So what we have here is we remove part of the information and we evaluate how the system is reacting. So this type of interpretability approaches are more or less the basic ones, the first ones that have been used for many years. Removal of information can also show you how that perturbation affects performance. And by a reduction of performance, you can see on the importance of that information that's being removed. Now, ethics. There's been recently, I think this is from last year, you can find the PDF here, a very nice statement about the importance of ethics of AI in radiology. And what I highlighted is this sentence here, you see at the bottom. So first of all, again, build patient and provider trust. I think this is, since we are starting, we need to build this trust. So this is essential right now. Maybe in 10 years, it's not gonna be different or gonna be lower. But what I really highlighted is this part here. So I'm gonna read it out loud. So similarly, if an algorithm fails or contributes to an adverse clinical event or malpractice, radiologists need to be able to understand why it produced the result that it did and how it reached a decision. And I think the bottom line is that we want to know, we want to build that trust, and we want to have mechanism to check. In the same way, when probably you are working with a trainee in radiology, you can challenge that trainee saying, explain me your thinking, your rationality, your process, right? And you want to check that to avoid biases and to make corrections accordingly. Now, in the community of medical image computing, we are quite late, I would say, compared to the computer vision, all this data I showed you before. Now, in 2018, we started talking about interpretability for medical image computing. Now, this year is the third year we are organizing this workshop called iMimic, and where we actually open the podium for people to talk about it from different areas, from different aspects, but also to bring techniques, to show examples how those techniques can be used for medical images and how they can bring value to interpretability. I'm gonna do a quick break. I think, how long, what time is it? 10:56. I'm gonna show you a video. And then probably we go for a very quick 5 minutes break. Now, I hope the audio will work on your end. Let me share. Okay, let me find now the video over here. Where is it? Here. Can you see the QuickTime player?
No.
Not yet. Let me see. I will probably stop and reshare. Maybe that works. Can you see it now? It should be a black window.
Yeah,
It's only black.
Okay, here we go.
It is difficult to appreciate just how far artificial intelligence has advanced. think that that's just going to unlock so much potential in so many different domains.
I resent right now that the neural net wave, the deep learning wave, has become so predominant that people say, well, that's the way to go. You just collect data and intelligence will work itself out. And that's just not true. I don't believe it.
There are many settings where a deep model trained on enough data that exhibits enough accuracy on test data is all you really need to go, and you don't need to be able to see what's inside that black box. However, there are other settings where that's a very risky thing to do.
Gain the insight. Once that insight is gained, then start applying rules and regulations.
In 2016, Europe passed a new omnibus piece of legislation called the General Data Protection Regulation. Europe treats data protection as a fundamental right, and GDPR is a big deal. They were worried about automated decision-making. The explanation is not possible, that either you can't use the technique or you do so at your own peril. At a certain point, the law is the law.
And we just find that every time we put on this magic glasses where we can see what's inside the model, we find an amazing number of things that are wonderful. But we also see things that are very surprising, very disturbing. It's just so important to be able to put on the magic glasses in many domains and see these things before you deploy. And then help you try to understand what's in it, opening up the black box.
All right, I propose a pause of maybe 11:05. We continue and we try to open. Pascale, we can continue.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so let's try to open this black box. And first we need to talk about some taxonomy. So black boxes, and there are many methods. They say this is a method operating on black box. What this means is that the method itself, doing the interpretability, have to have access to the internals of the model. They are also referred to as model agnostic. So this can be the case of you receive a product from a company and you have no access to the internals of the system. There you will need an interpretability approach that can operate on a black box. Now, the opposite is called white boxes. So this, for example, would be you develop your own deep learning system and then you have the access to the internals. Here, what we are going to talk about is gradient-based models. So here, the word gradient refers to the flow of information when we are working with deep learning. Probably you recall in a deep learning neural network, you have layers, and through layers, the information goes through. The gradient produces differences, how the information changes from one layer to the other, and this is the information that's used to provide interpretability. And there are also methods that operate by output. So we could say methods provide a visualization. These are the Saliency Maps, as we saw before. So they provide a pixel-wise value reflecting their importance, or people also call it attribution of that pixel to the task. And we are going towards the end. I'm going to show you one approach that outputs a concept. So this is a summary statement or a keyword. And there are other approaches that give you a feature importance. So they explain models by expressing an importance of features. For example, weights of a model can typically be used to say this parameters is very important. So we're going to check some of the methods. And this is from a Twitter from Christoph Molnar. He's doing his PhD in the area of interpretability, and I found it very amusing. There are so many approaches that he says it's like going to the supermarket and looking for yogurt, right? There are so many, and one gets overwhelmed. So I'm going to start from the very basic ones, or also more chronologically. One is called partial dependency plots. You can see it's from Friedman in 2001. So short PDP, basically they show the marginal effect that one or two features, so more than two features, this model or this approach is not the best, have on the predicted outcome of a machine learning model. PDP can show whether a relationship between target and a feature is linear, monotonous, or more complex. So first of all, it's a plot. I'm going to show you an example in the next slide, how this plot looks like. Now, the equation is saying very simple things. We're going to focus on the right one here, saying the importance of a feature can be measured as an average. You can see here the average of that model, F, could be a deep learning model, could be a classical linear model for machine learning. When we fixed a given value, let's say I want to see the impact of age on a patient, for example, on ovarian cancer. And I'm going to fix that value here, and I'm going to move the other features or variables or information of different patients and calculate an average. And so this is this marginalization. So we keep one fix and we move the other values, and we see how that model reacts to that perturbation. So let's see two concrete examples. On the left, we see predicted number of bikes. So here is a machine learning model that predicts a number of rentals for bikes depending on temperature, humidity, and wind speed. So you would like to see if the model learned the right thing. For example, we know that if the temperature goes up, typically the rentals at some point start decreasing because it's just too hot. The same with humidity, the same with wind speed. So what you see here for each of these points, you see that the system is saying what happens at 10 degrees Celsius, and I'm going to take all my data, fix 10 degrees, and I'm going to change the humidity and wind speed at different values from the data. And I'm going to see if the model is getting affected by that. Here we see that the relation between temperature and the prediction value of rentals it's nonlinear. So there is an increase, then stagnates around 20 degrees and then decreases. Now comes the subjectiveness of the evaluation. Here is where you as human evaluate sort of the plausiveness of this plot. We see the same on the right side with a medical example. Predicted cancer probability as a function of age and a function of years on our hormonal contraceptives. And we see the relationship that after 40, 42 years, there is an increase. The same happens after around, I would say 12, 15 years, there is around 10 years starts increasing rapidly. So this is to check these correlations or these relationships between a given variable of interest and the predicted output. Okay, it's useful when you have one or two features. More than two or three, it's hard to visualize, right? Then there is the limitation of the visualization. It is simple, it is easy to implement, but it doesn't account for correlation. So in machine learning, many times you have correlated features, and here you only look at one at a time. The next one is called individual conditional expectation, or short ICE. Basically, it's like PDP, but I'm going to, rather than going for an average, I'm going to plot all cases. You can see here that I don't have the sum anymore, the average in my formulation. I'm just going to change the actual values of the other features and the feature of interest. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to plot all cases. So you can see here the same example for the cancer probability versus age. I have all my data plotted. Now, this is useful. For example, here you see that there is a main pattern that PDP, you can see here, was showing. But there are cases that you might want to explore that are different than the average. And that's sort of the added value. So you have a plot that maybe is more messy in terms of the plot itself. The information amount is huge, but it can provide more information. Now, decision trees are, depending on their depth, can actually be interpretable. So if you're not familiar with decision trees, they are called trees because it looks like an inverted tree. You have nodes and you have these branches. The system is based on rules that are calculated with the training data. And here is an example. This system is detecting whether the picture here is an indoor picture or outdoor picture. So you have these rules. Is the top part blue? If yes. Is the bottom part blue? If no, well, it might be an outdoor picture, right? So this is the sort of the essential of a decision tree. In machine learning, decision trees then are, the position of these rules are selected by the model itself. So here could be a value of a feature, could be the age, could be the humidity in the example of the rentals, and the system starts sorting out the position of those features, and so which features are more important to separate my data. Now, this is understandable because first, if I don't have a very deep tree, I have very few rules, right? So I can really explain them individually. Now, each of these rules are simplifications. So what you see here is a tree, and on the right, you see how the data is being split by each node in the tree. Right? So at the beginning, let's say this separator is a rule, like a general rule that separates my data into this, say, red and black or blue, dark blue points. As I go deeper into the tree, I have more specific rules that start creating these separators. At the end, I have a very complex separation of the space, and I can nicely separate my data. This could be, for example, cancer versus non-cancer model. And explaining this rule might be more complex, but explaining the individual ones is simpler. Okay, so in essence, a decision tree is a rather interpretable, but it depends on the depth of the model and also the complexity of the individual features. Typically in the past, before deep learning, we used to hand engineer or handcraft our features. So we will design them based on a priori information, based on clinical facts, based on studies. We would actually engineer that information into a decision tree. So this is not so important. Now comes the transition towards deep learning. This is one interesting study that tries to show that decision trees and deep learning architectures, they have commonalities, and one can see that decision trees in a way become a subset or a specific case of a neural network. So this is a interesting work from Microsoft Research, so a few years, showing that we can actually learn from the previous decision tree research. Now, with deep learning, we have this very complex system. So how can we actually open the black box and try to understand them? So I'm going to go through some of the approaches and attempts to do this. So first of all, some of the basics, right? We are going to focus on convolutional neural networks. So as we probably saw, the aim of doing convolutions is to try to convey information from a patch into a very reduced set of information. So pixels are related. The the relationship between neighboring pixels brings information, right? It's actually also what makes texture very, very interesting for convolutional neural networks. And then we have a network that has different layers, and different layers are also coded in to do different things. For example, probably you have seen convolutional layers, then pooling layers, which basically it's just taking the most important part of the information, and then fully connected layers where you try to pass the information from all layers at the end of the network and from all cells or neurons in those layers to finally do a classification. For example, here classifying this input image into 1, 2, 3, 4 classes. So what people have tried to do in the past is to visualize those layers. And what you see here, for example, in 2013, these are patches in different levels of the architecture. So what happens here is that at the beginning, you see sort of these patches are like vertical stripes, horizontal stripes, different colors, black and white. There is like corners. There's something like a corner over here. It looks like the system is using very simple primitives to start analyzing this input image. Whereas as I move inside the network, the complexity of the patch increases. So you can see these patches are a lot of texture in there, right? Once I move further and further, the complexity of the analysis is just overwhelming. It's nearly impossible to understand the information in there. So that's the limitation we have today when we actually want to visualize the information inside a deep learning architecture. Now, Saliency Maps, on the other hand, they try to tell us what parts of the image are important for the classification. A very famous or popular approach is called LIME, and this stands for Local Interpretable Model Agnostic Explanation. So this is a good approach if you have a black box and you have no access to the internals of the model. How does it work? So it's a very simple approach. Imagine you have this image of a frog. This is a tree frog. And I want to understand what parts of this image classify that image as a tree frog. So for example, this model is telling me that there is a 54% probability that this is a tree frog. So what you see below here is a depiction of the samples. Let's say I have a training sample of frogs and cats and dogs, or different types of frogs. And everything that's in this pink zone, let's say, are frogs. Everything that's outside are not frogs, okay? This image over here, let's say it's this red cross here. So in my space of training samples, this is where my tree frog for this particular example would be. What I'm going to start doing is perturbing this image. You can see that here the perturbation is basically masking out parts of the image. So you can see here everything that's gray has been masked out in different levels. I can then take each of these perturbations, so these 1, 2, 3 images and more, and calculate the probability that this is a tree frog given by the model I want to interpret. So for example, here 85%, 0%, 52%. By doing these perturbations, what I'm basically doing, I'm creating new samples around that original image. So I'm creating sort of variations of the input. After I have those perturbations and I have those probabilities from the model I'm interpreting, I'm going to fit a very simple model, a linear model. This is dotted line you see here. So locally, I'm understanding what for this model means frog and not frog, right? If I move on the left or right side of this line. By creating that model, so we are doing a regression now using a linear model. I think Rafael probably showed this part. You can then make very simple explanations and start moving from the left and from the right of this line to then understand or maximize what are the actual pixels that drive the decision. You can finally see that this part of the image for this model is the most important part describing a tree frog. So Lime has also been used on the images of the Labrador, or the example I showed you before on the Husky dog, as a counterexample to show that one can, with this approach, can find out potential bias in the data. So I'm going to skip the algorithmic part. I don't think it's important for you to know that part, and jump into this one. What you see in the middle, it's a depiction of what a deep neural network understands as a goose. So what you see on the left, again, is my space of training samples. So these are non-goose examples, and these are my each blue point corresponds to an image of a goose. I'm going to then create a system that, let's say this is my neural network, that classify that image into, let's say, a cheeseburger, a goose, or a car. And I'm going to create an image synthetically that maximizes the activation of this class goose. And I'm going to visualize that image. And this is the result of that maximization process. So you can see there is some aspects of a goose, right? People call this deep dreaming in the literature of interpretability. So this is a neural network sort of internal view of understanding or perception of what a goose is. And let me show you other examples. For a bell pepper, a lemon, a husky, washing machine, computer keyboard, a kid fox, limousine, an ostrich, and a goose. Personally, some of these images are really difficult to understand, right? Like the limousine, probably you see the windows or the wheel over here. So there's the subjectivity aspect to it as well. What you see on the right is now the comparison to a occlusion test. So occlusion tests now are very simple. I'm going to start removing pixel at a time, and I'm going to run the model on that modified version of the image. And if that model was classified correctly, was trained correctly to classify that image, those pixels describing the concept are going to be the most important one when I occlude them. And this is what you see here when I occlude the dog, this is the cathedral, the monkey, the truck. But you can see that the model also picks on other parts of the image to drive the decision. And here's where interpretability can help us to say, well, does this make sense that this part of the image is used by the model? These researchers, they took this idea of deep dreaming a bit further to bring more realistic description. So this is the same. I would like to now describe a cheeseburger, and I would like to create a cheeseburger that maximizes that activation. And this is the image you get. So it's much realistic than what I showed you before. And this is done by actually going in both ways of a deep learning architecture. So typically, your image starts here. We do our convolutions, all our processes, pooling, and then we end up with a class that's maximized. Let's say this image includes a candle, so that the candle class is maximized. Now, I'm going to reverse that process, and I'm going to find an image that maximizes the candle by going backwards. So all these blocks over here are the counter units of the ones we have on the direct path, on the right side. So by doing that, I'm actually creating an image that's more realistic than just purely mathematically finding a pixel by pixel image that, for example, describes a goose. And here you see examples that do look more realistic. They look very artistic, right? For different objects. Now, in medicine, these techniques have not been applied yet. As I mentioned, the area of interpretability is around, for medical images, around 2-3 years old. And therefore, many of these techniques are being now tested to describe, for example, a typical lesion, what the system is understanding when we say this is a multiple sclerosis lesion. I would like to have an example of that from the network. And you can see here the results on different natural images. Now, let me show you another type of methods called gradient-based methods. So let's say we have this image here with cars, and I would like to understand what the network understands about a car, why this image is about cars. So we are going to analyze here the gradient of the deep learning architecture. So gradient is basically the changes of the information going across the network. So these are these derivatives here. I want to measure the changes across between input and output of a deep learning architecture. Now you can do a summation and then square it of those changes, and then you can visualize it. So for each pixel, you can see how important that gradient is. The basic idea here is that the magnitude of the gradient reflects the importance of the input. So when we do deep learning, we have these activations, and the activations, the magnitude of that activation reflects how important that part of the image is for the decision. There have been many variations. For example, researchers have proposed to actually multiply this image with the input image to bring a bit more context or semantics to the saliency map, because this image is pretty noisy and it's a bit of out of context, right? So people are trying to add more information in a very simple form of a multiplication, okay? And the other variations I'm not going to go through, but it's just to show you that the people have recognized the problems with gradient-based approaches and are trying to solve them, okay? I'm going to focus a bit more on one approach called Grad Cam. And Grad Cam basically is the same. It shows us parts of the image that are important. For example, here, an original image, guided back propagation on cat. So this is what parts of the image are important for the class cat. So this is with pure gradients, right? So you see a lot of the dog as well, right? The same for the dog, you see a lot of the cat. So what they propose is actually to create a mask that's more smooth. You can see here, this is for the class cat, and this is for the class dog. So in a way, it's more reliable than pure gradients. When you combine these two, you can have a bit of in-between solution, what's called a guided Grad Cam for cat and for dog. The intention doing this is, for example, to give more details, right? If you let's say you want to go beyond this blob telling you this part of the image is important and I want to know more on that blob, you can actually combine these two images by multiplication. And this is just for comparison by occlusion. So we saw that occlusion is kind of a basic approach where we just black out pixels and we see how that model's performance decreases. Okay, how does it work, Grad Cam? We analyze the gradient. So remember, we have this neural network architecture, and we are going to analyze the flow of information from the output into the inside. We are going to go per layers and also per neurons. So that's this double sum you see here. And I'm going to sum up all contributions for that class C. For example, this could be a given label, one of these three, for each of the different layers and neurons. So this A corresponds to a layer, J, and neuron I. So I'm going to sum this up, and then I'm going to calculate from this a neuron importance weight. Basically, all this is saying is the higher the activation, the more important that weight is. And I'm going to use that weight and I'm going to combine it with the pure activation per layer. So here I have 1, 2, 3 layers. So I have 3 of these layers. I'm going to multiply them by the corresponding weights that sum up all contributions for each layer. And I'm going to take only the positive part. This is this ReLU activation probably you saw in the basics of the deep learning. This is just saying, just take the positives that you find here. And then it's a visualization of that map. Let me show you interesting some failure cases where Grad Cam can be used to spot problems. For example, here you see this is a volcano with a lake, and the ground truth for this image was a volcano. So this is a volcano image. But the model predicted a sandbar. When you look at the Saliency Maps from the Grad Cam, this is multiplied by the gradients, you see that the volcano is no longer there. So that system didn't actually use the information in the image to detect the volcano. Over here you see an image. This is also a volcano, but the system actually picked on the edges, and that gave the impression to the model that this is a mirror, right? So this shows us effects or biases in the data or confounders that are fooling the network. I'm going to jump into, because of time, I'm going to jump into, I think, the most important part over here. So today, if we look for the best or the best approach to do interpretability, LRP is one of them. So LRP also looks into the gradient information across a network, but it's going to analyze per layer, and that's in the name layer-wise. So the problem here, the motivation behind using LRP is that when you have a very deep architecture, your gradients starts getting very, very, very small as you go inside the network. Because what happens is that you are multiplying with values that are lower than 1. By doing this many, 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 many times, your actual value you are having is close to 0. So this is called a gradient saturation or shattered gradients that happen. So the gradient values are very small, and also they get very shaky. So as I go down, you can see here, my gradient information start getting very perturbed. And this affects many of the approaches we saw before. They create a lot of noise in the Saliency Maps. So what they propose is actually to look at the layer-wise, rather than putting things together, all the contributions as before. Now we are going to do it layer-wise. So we have a black box, and we want to decompose the layers here into individual components. So we have this function, that's what the machine is doing, and I want to describe this as a sum of different contributions that are layer-wise. So here you see the different layers, and I'm going to compute relevance scores that are per layer. And I'm going to normalize them because I want to have similar contributions per layer. By doing this operation, you have a more robust approach than, for example, Grad Cam, as I showed you before. Here there are some examples from the computer vision community again. This is the first examples. For example, pure gradient, these are cars. And with LRP, you see the information is more clear. It's less noisy, and I think it's more interpretable than using pure gradients. The same with numbers. We can look at what defines, for example, a number 2, or what defines a number 8. And overall, LRP and Deep Taylor, I also have to say, is very similar. I'm not going through it, but it's very similar. I would say, the most robust approaches that if I'm asked, what would you use in practice? I would say LRP or Deep Taylor are state-of-the-art approaches for Saliency Maps. Now, you might ask, why? What about the others? Are there problems? And yes, there are problems. Not all saliency map approaches are equally good. What you see here is a study from Google Brain. Bin Kim is an active researcher here in this area. And what they did is actually show that many of these methods, they are very insensitive to changes in the image or changes to the architecture. Many of these approaches also, they act as pure edge detectors, which is very worrisome. For example, you see definition of a corn. The gradient image here is a bit everywhere, and you can see here the guided backprop. You have all, okay, it's a bit better, but when you compare it to an edge detector, you see some similarities. They did some experiments here. Yeah, it's coming in the next slide, where they actually perturb the network, perturb the images, and you see little changes in the saliency maps. So this is what they call model parameter randomization test and data randomization test. So they perturb both model parameters as well as the labels or the data itself. And the idea was that if I do those perturbations, my saliency map should also change. But that's not what they found. For example, the guided backpropagation. If I start shuffling the weights of a neural network, guided backpropagation doesn't really get affected. And that's worrisome. That shows us that the saliency map, although it might look appealing, although it might look a sound, they are biased by construction. So now we have this, we face this area of research where we want to now validate the saliency maps themselves. So we have interpretability approaches to audit deep learning systems, but now we need to make sure that the interpretability approach itself is reliable. So as wrap-up of saliency methods, there are many. Visual evaluation alone can be misleading. We just talked about it. These methods require access to the model architecture. So if you have a software from a company, you cannot use these methods. You could use something like Lime, for example. And assessment of this method is an active field of research. So we need to be careful when just jumping into a method and just using it off the bat. That's what I want to say. And there is a lack of, at the last point, there is a lack of integration of expert knowledge. And this is a sort of the same problem with deep learning itself, right? That we are just so data-driven that we overlook the expert knowledge that's already existing. Let me show you, to start finalizing, a completely different approach based on concepts. So for example, to motivate this is, you have here this image of a cash machine. You see the ATM, but this is accompanied by many other objects. Here you see another sliding door, but gradient approaches, you can see that the system is, okay, it seems the ATM is about here. It seems the person is also there, right? The same for the sliding door. There is a lot of this part over here, which seems to be the hand or the person, right? So there is a lot of ambiguity in these approaches. The approach here is, if I could create a concept, for example, of cash machine, or a concept of a sliding door, and I could ask the system, tell me how sensitive you are to that concept. That would be much reliable than if I try to understand what a saliency map is telling me. So this is what generated this approach called testing with concept activation vectors, or short TCAV. So we have a neural network with all the different calculations, and we have a different class. So this is for the specifics of classification. I would like to now create a concept, for example, gender or race or a color, and I would like to know how important that concept is to the prediction. Here, what's important is even if the concept was not part of the training of that model. Now, how does it work? Let's say I want to understand how a model is sensitive to the concept of zebra-ness. So you see this picture here, and you see the stripes. So I could create different images of let's say, zebra-ness with stripe images, and I want to evaluate how sensitive my model is to that concept of how much zebra-ness is in that image. So how does it work? Here, another example, for example, with gender. If I pass this image to a deep learning system and I say, tell me if there is a doctor or not, but I would like to make sure that gender is not used as part of the decision-making of that neural network. So how can I check that there is no bias saying, well, if I see a woman, probably it's a doctor. If I see a man, probably it's a doctor, right? So this concept in this case would be a doctorness, and I would like to know if there's a bias in my model. Okay, so let's now see how it works. First, one is required to have a set of concepts of examples. So here you see for the zebra, I have different examples here, plus random images. So random images can be here something that's not related to the concept. I'm going to then take a model that I want to interpret, and I'm going to split the model in two parts. So you can see this first part here until this layer here corresponds to a representation of the input data. So you can imagine that what I receive here is a description of the input here. And I'm going to then call that FL for layer L is a descriptor F. Okay. I'm going to then take my sample images for the concept and the non-concept, and I'm going to pass them through my network. This will generate different descriptors. I'm also going to classify them. So I'm going to go all the way and classify them between the given class I'm checking. So for example, here you see I'm applying my model at a given layer L, so up to here, for all my non-concept as well as my concept samples. And I'm going to then create a model that separates between these two. So I want to differentiate between concept and non-concept objects. This generates this red arrow you see here, which is telling me I'm moving away from the concept, in the other direction, away from the concept or towards the concept. So in this case, my concept could be zebra-ness, but in medicine, this could be vascularity of the tumor. I'm going to show you an example on retinal image. And I'm moving closer or near to the concept or away from it. Okay. So I have my descriptors, as we saw here, my model, I have my direction, so I can move away and towards the concept. And then I'm going to measure a sensitivity of that model in that direction. So what you see here is this variable S is measuring a sensitivity of my model to a given class K, sensitivity to concept C, for example, zebra-ness, at layer L. And that's defined as how much this gradient, so how much my probabilities, remember at the end of a neural network we have probabilities, how much this is changing as I move away or towards that concept. So this equation is telling me, calculate the probability that that input image is a zebra, and I'm going to measure that change of probabilities in a given direction, right? So the direction is very important because it's defining the concept or how much the concept is present or in that moment. And then I'm going to then just accumulate this for a given training set. This equation here is just telling me how much positive activations I have over a complete training data set. So it's a fraction of inputs that are activated by that, for example, stripe image, right? So for example, here you see this input image, and I have three concepts. One is a dotted, stripe, and zigzag. And you can see that this model is very sensitive to the stripe concept, telling us that to classify this image, let's say as a zebra, the pattern or the concept of stripe is very important to the model. So that way we can perform quality assurance of the model. We can verify any potential bias. Let me show you an example here where they detected a bias in data. They trained a model to classify images of fire worker trucks. And you can see that when they tested the concept of colors, red, yellow, blue, and green, you can see that most of the training data actually had red trucks. So the system was very sensitive to the concept of redness. When the system was actually shown yellow, red trucks, the accuracy of the detector was really low. So this analysis showed that there was a bias in the data. And the same they found, for example, definition of ping pong ball, because many images included East Asian players. So the system was actually using that to classify that image as a ping pong ball. The same with rugby balls or dumbbell. The presence of arms, for example, was actually there's a correlation there that the system was used. In diabetic retinopathy, this has also been used. And here the same, they show, so here you have 5 levels typically to define diabetic retinopathy. And they tested a system that was classifying these images automatically. And they showed that the amount of aneurysm was actually misleading part of the grading on these images. So this showed the ophthalmologist using the system that there was a bias in that model, since many of these cases were actually graded level 2 of retinopathy, whereas they were actually level 1, and this was due to oversensitivity of the model to aneurysm. I'm going to finish with another approach where you have multi-sequence data. So imagine you have a problem where you want to classify input images, but you have several sequences. And you would like to know what drives the sequence, the decision, and which sequences and which parts of the images within those sequences. So here, this is part of work we have done in Bern, where we actually describe a interpretability approach, where first we use representation mapping. So this is a Boltzmann machine, which is nothing else than a compact representation of the inputs. So here you have the different sequences and all concatenated to describe all information into one descriptor. And then we have a classifier using a decision tree to actually perform a segmentation of these images. So we wanted to now understand which sequences are driving the segmentation for the different compartments of this tumor and which parts of the images are important. So what we here we figure out is a feature importance that's depending on the sequence. So what I'm going to show you here is a diagram that shows very important features on the left, not important features on the right, and then they are per sequence. So it looks like this. So you have these now 4 rows showing that for segmentation, this was a segmentation task, of enhancing tumor, the T1 contrast image is the most important. Now, this aligns with the criteria and how neuroradiologists do it. So this is a verification, it's a quality assurance action that we can use from these feature importance maps. And moreover, what's very interesting is here, you can see the sequence, the corresponding sequence, and you can see here the feature map. So in other words, these figures here, 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 and here, this is how the neural network looks at the sequence, and is the information that drives that task. So you can see here that this part of the tumor are the most important, and they're highlighted to perform segmentation of the T1 contrast. Yeah. Let me show you now a counterexample where we actually, through this analysis, we spotted issues in our pre-processing. So we detected a bias in our skull stripping, and this was actually biasing our model. And the model was actually looking at the borders of the image, was looking at this area here to perform the task. So interpretability can help to confirm a mechanism of how things should work, or how a human would do it, but also to detect potential bias in the data. Now, I think it's important to mention we can combine these approaches. So we can have the typical probabilities, output probabilities of a neural network, right? We know this is not sufficient. We can combine it with areas of attention or saliency maps. So we can show which areas of the images are important. And we can also show matched real cases. And I think this is sort of overlooked area in radiology, where typically doctors, they want to find real cases that match that condition in order to compare. So it can be used as a counterfactual example or as a similar example of the same condition. Finally, we can also combine concepts. For example, a system outputting that these images are classified as a cardiomegaly because there is an enlargement of the heart region. And so you have here a more word-based or statement-based approach of interpretability. Just to finalize, we quickly asked radiologists. Was a poll we ran last, and we asked them about their opinion on interpretability. So first, we asked them whether this is useful, whether this is something we should promote in the future. And I think more than 80% they said yes, that's something important. The question then was why this would be important. Here you see this distribution of specialties. So this was 8 responders, what you see here. Later we extended to 100, but the results more or less the same. Age distribution and years of experience. We did not find a correlation between the years of experience and the need for interpretability, as we actually expected to see some of the younger people to be willing to use this more than the more experienced doctors. And when we asked them for which purpose, they say they would like to first use them in order to have security. So this is the whole trust. They want to make sure the system is trustful, and they want to have means to audit the system. Now, the kind of information, they said it doesn't matter how, as long as it's understandable and not time-consuming. And the most popular answer was visual cues are, because then it's very fast, right? To look at the interpretability and see whether that makes sense for a doctor. Finally, which aspect of interpretability is more critical? And the most important part was safety and efficacy. They want to make sure that the systems are safe, and therefore interpretability can help to enhance that aspect. All right, what's beyond for us in interpretability? Now, this is maybe in the next 10 years, there's some work on the problem of causality. So there's something called causal inference. Today with deep learning, we are in associational modeling. So we are modeling relations between features and outputs. We, as an AI community, should be moving towards a counterfactual status, going through an interventional status where we can place questions like, what if this event would happen? Into questions like, what was it X that caused Y? So that's a causality inference. Now, for AI, the counterfactual calls for alternative worlds. So today we can simulate data with AI, and the idea is to create counterfactual scenarios that can be used to interpret systems performance. Let me show you one example that was shown a few years ago. 2014, DeepMind showed this amazing result of a system who learned to play Breakout. So everyone was in awe looking at how good the system was. But what happened when the AI system is confronted with changes? For example, here on the left there was this block, and on the right you see that the pad was advanced some distance. And you can see that the system was not capable of adapting to that. So the system just learned an associational model, input and output, but it's not capable of adapting. So what they propose in this article is something that incorporates intuitive physics. It actually incorporates physical laws into the learning of the system. Actually, the system now better models a cause effect and can generalize much better, and can also explain. But you see the trajectories on the right. You can see the system is why the system took a given decision. So this is, I think, the next steps for us in terms of interpretability and in general for AI, moving maybe away from associational modeling into a causal inference approach. All right, so to wrap up, interpretability of ML system is not a new topic. In computer vision, I show many examples, and it is starting in medical imaging. The goal of interpretability is not to understand every part, but to have enough information for the task at hand. So we talk about auditability, trustability, adaptability, and understanding of the inner workings of a system. Visualization techniques are very popular. We talk about sort of the selected ones. It's an active area of research. Many of these techniques and there's a lot of work that can be done for medical imaging. Benchmarking or evaluation of these approaches is still an open and explored area. So this is my word of caution to you that not all methods are reliable. And most likely a task-dependent combination of approaches will actually work in practice. So I let you some of the papers in case you want to go deeper into the material. Resources, we have the website for the iMimic where you can find the talks from the previous years, as well as the whole set of contributions. There is a blog from Christoph Molnar where many of these approaches are nicely described. And if you are into some coding, there is this investigate Python library that incorporates many of these approaches. Thank you very much for your attention. It's been a pleasure presenting virtually at this event, and don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions. Thank you very much.